side of the argument. There is only one knowledge mark, and so candidates really need to think about how they are answering these E questions. For example, paper 1-1, question 3E. Do you think the government of country T should help businesses such as Grimshaw set up in its country? Justify your answer. Reasons why governments might help businesses set up, such as to create jobs leading to lower unemployment. And then the other point might be that profits could flow out of the country and taxes avoided being paid. Answering in the context of a company that manufactures mobile phones is also needed, and then a decision should be made as to whether the government would be advised to encourage this business or not, and to give reasons why. A common mistake is that even when candidates have given points on both sides, they do not come to a decision. It is possible that they think that because they have made points on both sides that they have answered the question. For example, paper 1-2, question 1E. Consider two possible methods of promotion that Walt could use for the new computer game. Recommend which method he should use. Justify your answer. The answer might explain why he might use one method and why he might use another method, but never make a decision as to which is the better method to use and why. This will limit the mark to a maximum of 4 out of 6. The candidate needs to go on and say yes, well, more than just yes or no, or of which option to choose. It's not sufficient for a judgment, as the candidate needs to explain why that judgment has been made. Evaluation marks cannot be awarded if this has not been done. A lot of points on each side are not needed. A clearer argument as to why it might be successful, and then a clear argument as to why it might not be successful in the context of the business, and then a decision of yes, no and why is all the candidate needs to do to gain 6 marks. Advice to candidates for paper 1. To summarise the advice that can be given to candidates for paper 1. Follow the command words in the question. Make sure, if the question says, identify and explain, that this is what you are doing. If it says calculate or define or do you think, candidates need to make sure they actually do follow these command words. Learn precise definitions for key terms to make sure that in the A and possibly the B questions that all the definition marks are gained. Show all the working in calculation questions to ensure that if errors are made, marks can still be awarded for a correct method. Make sure the stem of the question is read carefully. This is to make sure that the answers are all applied to the business in the particular question. This in many ways is the most important. This is the assessment objective for which many candidates fail to pick up the marks. Read the information within the stem as they go through the answers. Sometimes by the time a candidate gets to question D and E, they seem to have forgotten about what the stem is about. I would suggest it would be worthwhile for candidates to go back to the stem before they answer questions D and E, to remind themselves of the context. Develop a 2-sided argument for E questions, and then make a decision based on the earlier points made. The decision should be justified, and it should be in the context of the business in the stem of the question. So just to be clear, slide 9 and slide 10 give feedback on key themes for paper 1. Slide 11 gives advice to candidates for paper 1. I will now go on to slide 12. This will be outlining concepts that were not well understood on paper 1. There were a few terms on these papers that candidates were often confusing, and this was common across the 3 papers. Terms that were commonly confused or not well understood were terms like batch production, which was often confused with flow or job production, How to calculate average cost. The formula was not always understood. Candidates didn't always understand cash flow deficit issues. It's quite common that cash flow and profit is confused. And sometimes these are also confused with income statements. Candidates could think that a positive cash flow must mean that the business is making a profit. And that's part of the lack of understanding of the difference between cash flow and profit. Profit and sales are also often confused. This is often where candidates will talk about an increase in sales, and they often, sometimes they mean an increase in profit and vice versa. They'll interchange the terms profit and sales, so they should be careful. Make sure that they are using the appropriate term. Diseconomies and economies of scale again can be confused, and particularly how they can be applied to a particular business. Candidates should be able to apply these and not just be able to just name economies of scale, for example. Market share and shares sold by a limited company. Candidates confuse the word share there and mix those terms up. Delegation was also not always well understood, as was profit margin and liquidity. Again, a common concepts that candidates don't understand what they are and also the difference between them. And finally, on these particular papers, the contents of a business plan was not always well understood. Exemplification of paper 1 answers. There will now be several slides that follow that contain candidate answers for a selection of paper 1 questions. First of all, look at the mark scheme and then the candidate answer, and then decide what mark you would award. After you've decided what mark to award, it's worth moving on to the next slide after that, where I will explain the marks that were actually awarded for each particular answer. This gives you the mark scheme for an example of a C question. This is question 1C from paper 1-1. The questions have 2 knowledge marks available and 2 application marks. The question requires candidates to identify 2 possible advantages of using batch production and then explaining each of these advantages in the context of the business given at the top of the question. And in this question, it was TWH, a business making toys using batch production. This has a candidate response to this question 1C from paper 1-1. If you've looked at the mark scheme on slide 14, now on slide 15, read the candidate answer and decide what mark this answer should have been awarded. This slide has the marks annotated on the candidate answer to show where the marks were awarded. And this example gains all 4 marks available, as there were 2 benefits given: flexibility in type of toys produced and also high quality toys produced due to the workers being more specialised in their jobs, making them more highly skilled, and hence increasing the quality of output. Both advantages were clearly in the context of this business, which makes toys, and hence full marks were awarded. This gives a second example of a C question. In this case, it is question 4C from paper 1-2. This is the mark scheme. I suggest you have a look through the mark scheme and see how the marks are awarded. This question required explanation of how an increase in interest rates affected this business outlined at the start of the question. This is a public limited company that builds large luxury houses. Again, 2 marks are for identifying how an increase in interest rates affect a business, and 2 marks are for answering in the context of luxury houses. This is an example of a candidate answer for question 4C from paper 1-2. Read the candidate answer in the light of the mark scheme that was outlined on slide 17 and decide what mark